Growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s, it was impossible to avoid the craze that was Harry Potter. That now stained name was once a beacon of escapism for children, teenagers, and adults alike, as fans got lost in the 7 books and 8 movies over the better part of 15 years. I found myself as part of that camp just as much as anyone else during my youth. I must have read through the series at least 3 or 4 times during my teenage years and watched most of the movies countless times. Goblet of Fire was always my favorite. It was a beast of a book, dominating the much thinner titles on my shelf, as if at any moment it could consume them whole. It was only outdone in length by one other book on the shelf, The Order of the Phoenix. I remember those days fondly, wishing so desperately to become a part of that world. Even a middle-of-the-road, plain Jane, average Hogwarts student surely had a more interesting life than I. Longing to replace history, math, and biology with potions, transfiguration, and charms, I'd spend afternoons pretending I was at Hogwarts, taking classes and learning spells. As a kid, I even went so far as to use a long piece of Tinker Toys as a wand. It sounds embarrassing to say that out loud now in my adulthood, but during those youthful childhood days, it was a great way to spend a rainy day trapped at home. I can't help but to crack a smirk thinking back to those times. However, as I got older, my interest in the franchise disapparated. Even as I type this script, I can say that I haven't watched one of the movies or read one of the books in over a decade now. The Fantastic Beasts series, or whatever it's called, has gone completely off my radar, and therefore, the only Harry Potter content that I've experienced in the past 10 years has been a trip or two to Universal Studios to visit the illustrious Diagon Alley, Hogwarts Castle, and its accompanying rides and attractions. And to be honest with you, I'm shocked as I reflect on that. I hardly even noticed that one of my most adored childhood entertainment sources has become so irrelevant to me. And then, bam! Hogwarts Legacy, out of nowhere, the long-rumored open-world RPG where you become a student at the illustrious wizarding school. It was announced and then released, and now here we are. And honestly, I think it's a pretty good game. Not spectacular, not a disaster, just a good game. You'd be hard-pressed to call it one of the best open-world games of all time, despite the incredible sales numbers. Hell, it's not even a top 5 entry from the last 5 years or so. Parts of its world are detailed, but much of it remains stagnant. Its characters are relatively generic. The story is pretty simple, and its combat is somewhat fresh, but repetitive. It's one of those titles where none of the usual gaming conventions excel, while simultaneously nothing really drags them down either. Would I recommend people to play this game? Yes, absolutely, but I'd sooner recommend other open world games, like Elden Ring, Horizon Forbidden West, Ghost of Tsushima, and Red Dead Redemption 2. However, there is something that this game delivers that no other title ever released has. It's something that goes beyond the normal bounds of video game mechanics and their stories. Hogwarts Legacy's greatest strength comes in the player's ability to roleplay, to live out the life of a Wizarding World student with very little stopping you from doing so. If you've always wanted to be a Gryffindor or a Slytherin or a Hufflepuff or a Ravenclaw, you are in luck, because this game will let you play out that fantasy for as long as you want. And when that escapism begins to fade, well, there's still a pretty darn good game left to play. It all starts with the game's namesake, Hogwarts. While other parts of this wizarding world like the Ministry of Magic, Gringotts, and Diagon Alley remain fascinating, it's of course the school itself that dominates this IP. The castle overlooking a dark lake as stars light up the night sky is the first thing that comes to mind when I think of the franchise. And I'm surely not alone. As backwards as it may sound, crafting the open world in this open world game was actually far less important than getting its anchor location right. Hogwarts needed to be perfect, and by George, they freaking did it. There's a goosebump-inducing feeling that will wash over any fan of the series the first time they're set free to explore the castle's interior. I was so stunned at the level of detail that I spent a good hour just wandering around, checking out the many corridors, towers, and dungeons, marveling at all the artifacts on display, some familiar, some brand new. Iconic areas like the Great Hall and the Grand Staircase feel wonderfully realized, both faithful to their depiction in the movies while also providing a new take. But the level of detail is not reserved just for these marquee areas, as even the most hidden areas are brimming with detail. Whether it's uncovering miscellaneous artifacts, discovering Peeves getting into some mischief, or even just observing the paintings as they observe you back, everything feels alive within the castle walls. I could not bring myself to stop marveling at what Portkey Games had built here. Even the most seemingly nonsensical architecture described in the books can be found here, with staircases that lead to more staircases, and little hidden nooks found all over the place. The classrooms are all custom made as well, very much reflecting their movie counterparts quite faithfully. This feeling of awe is something that endured throughout my playthrough. Every time I ventured back for a class or woke up in the Ravenclaw dormitory, it just felt right to be here. It's an incredible centerpiece that felt like a character in its own right, owed to its atmosphere, high level of detail, and dedication to honoring the source material. Of course, it doesn't stop there. Early on in your playthrough, you'll be whisked away to Hogsmeade as well. This quiet, unassuming little village was another iconic location in the books and movies, and here it's home to many recognizable shops. Zonko's House of Pranks, Ollivander's Wands, Tomes and Scrolls, Honeydukes, and the Three Broomsticks are all fully explorable amongst many others. After spending an hour exploring Hogwarts, I was stunned to take a trip here and uncover even more familiar locations realized in such an incredible way. It genuinely felt like stepping into the world of Harry Potter for a little bit. It was like listening to a greatest hits album, uncovering some of the classics and discovering a few new locations I wasn't familiar with quite yet. Of course, Hogwarts and Hogsmeade aren't the only locations to be found in this open world, but they certainly are the most well realized. Hogsmeade Station and the Forbidden Forest are open to venture through as well, but outside of this, much of the remaining open world feels relatively uninspired and samey. Since this game is based in Scotland, it was impossible to incorporate a bunch of different biomes without losing touch with the reality of this place. As a result, you'll find an occasional bog or cliffside, but for the most part, it's a lot of forest land with a repetitive color palette throughout. This feels relatively uninspired, but again, they were faithful to the real-world counterpart, so it sort of comes with the territory. I can't help but to feel the biggest missed opportunity came in the design of local towns and villages. Hogsmeade is brilliant, but all the rest of the towns feel incredibly similar, with very little making them stand out at all. You'll find similar architecture made of the same building materials as you skip from town to town. The only reason to even stop at these is to check out the merchants and pick up the side quests. Outside of that, there's no internal motivation to stop at them. Nothing lures you in except for the artificial map markers. And in a world with magic, I can't help but to feel some cooler and more interesting villages with unique stories or characters could have been included, but unfortunately, we don't get that. The rest of the open world ends up feeling like a flyover state, which is appropriate given that a broomstick is the horse of this game. After about 25% of the game, players can buy a broom, creating a happy medium between walking and fast travel. True to the universe, flying is incorporated pretty well. The broom feels a bit tough to control at first, but with practice and some upgrades, it quickly feels responsive. With that being said, it's up to players to create their own fun with this means of traversal. It's extremely easy to soar high up and fly in a straight line towards your objective, but it is quite boring to do so. It's much more enjoyable to bob and weave through tree lines and dip close to watery surfaces to add a bit of flair to flight. Taking off from the ground into freeform flying is impressive, and it's that moment of takeoff that feels the most exhilarating as you quickly accelerate towards the next stop. All in all, it's pretty cool. You know, ever since playing Horizon Forbidden West, I've been thinking more about how developers not only build worlds geographically, but also how they inhabit them culturally. That game did an outstanding job with presenting its cultures, but the same can't be said here in Hogwarts Legacy. Many characters you find roaming around towns are quite boring and one-note with very little personality. They also don't have a whole lot of information to share about their towns or the surrounding areas. Only information related to quests is spoken on, and as a result, there's only occasionally something interesting to learn about the world, such as a town being taken over by spiders. That's a one-off instance, and that's the only memorable thing I can remember. Most of the characters inhabiting this world don't feel like a small part of a bigger community, they instead exist solely to sell you things and beg for help. Again, in a world with magic, there was a real opportunity to create some interesting characters instead of having 8 towns with a bunch of farmers and peasants. They failed on this front. So collectively then, the open world design of Hogwarts Legacy is a bit of a mixed bag. So much detail was crammed into making Hogwarts and Hogsmeade that everything else sort of went to the wayside. To be honest, I prefer what we got here compared to an inverse world where the familiar locations are half-assed and the open world is brilliant. In the end, the team got the most important elements right, and then some, but they failed in creating an open world around it with any sort of appeal or spectacle. As with any open world game, you can expect to find many activities for completion. In Hogwarts Legacy, it's easiest to think of 5 categories of quests. These include main quests, companion quests, side quests, assignments, and miscellaneous tasks. Main quests end up dominating this lineup in terms of quality, as they are by far the most varied and interesting missions to attend to. Essentially, your character is dropped into this world as a 5th year student at Hogwarts, after recently discovering your affinity for magic. Since you're a newcomer, you'll have to work to catch up to the other students by completing classes and furthering your education. At the same time, you're also a rare wizard or witch who is capable of seeing and using ancient magic, which is of course magic that's, well, old, I guess? The game doesn't elaborate on it much. Anyway, main quests then become a seesaw, pivoting back and forth with one side concerned with attending classes and learning skills, while the other side is about stopping an evil group of goblins from taking over the world using that ancient magic. In one mission, you'll be attending herbology with Professor Garlic here, and next thing you know, you'll be working with a friendly goblin named Lodgok to learn more about the evil goblin's motivations, or maybe even completing an ancient trial to prove your worth. The game has you bouncing back and forth between missions like these as you complete the main story. Often these quests will take about 20 to 45 minutes to complete, and are also chock full of references that Harry Potter fans will adore. My favorite of which was one sequence where you consume a polyjuice potion to gain access to the headmaster's office. Between story progression, great references, and the variety, main missions end up being the best type of quest in the game. Following this, we have a series of 3 companion quest lines where you'll help fellow Hogwarts students in completing a task that's near and dear to them. We have the Slytherin boy Sebastian Sallow, the Gryffindor girl Not Sioni, and the Hufflepuff Poppy Sweetings. To be quite blunt, it feels like only one of these quest lines was given enough time and development to make it partially interesting, and that would be Sebastian's. Nat's side's quest is about helping her to stop a group of local Hellraisers called the Ashwinders. They go around destroying homes, extorting villagers, and killing off people who try to bring them to justice. Back in Natsai's home country, a similar group of people were responsible for the death of her father, and she feels like by stopping them here, it may bring her some peace of mind. It's a pretty generic stop the bad guy story with a really lame ending. At one point, Natsai tells you that her and her father were animaguses, meaning they could turn into animals. Poachers attempted to kill them when they were in their animal form, but her father jumped in front of the bullets, sacrificing himself to save her. It's pretty obvious that a parent would do this instinctually for their child. Nothing too deep about it. Sweet, but not deep. So then, in the last leg of the questline, you come face to face with Harlow, the leader of the Ashwinders, and Natsai dives in front of a Crucio curse to save you from being harmed. And then she gives this grand speech about how she gets it now. She understands that her father did it because he loved her and acted out of instinct. The character states this like it's some sort of deep revelation, but it really isn't. It feels extremely flat and underdeveloped. Poppy Sweeting's questline is about helping to stop another group of poachers by working alongside of the centaurs in the Forbidden Forest. Along the way, you manage to save a whole host of different magical beasts, which is sort of cool, but again, it feels like a traditional stop the bad guys story without any sort of character depth or moral inquiry. There's no gray area, making it all sort of generic once more. The characters themselves aren't very interesting either. Sebastian's questline, though, is a lot more fleshed out. His set of missions is centered on helping him to find something that can cure a curse that was put on his sister years ago. Sebastian is good-intentioned as he spends night and day looking for some way to help her, but this questline is interesting because of the extreme measures he takes to achieve that goal. He believes that a cure might exist somewhere in the dark arts, and so you'll accompany him in exploring underground tombs and dungeons in search of artifacts that might help her. Along the way, you'll learn the 3 unforgivable curses if you so choose. As the questline continues, this young man slips further and further away from purity, committing horrible acts in the name of saving his sister. At one point, you can feel his sanity slipping away, as even those close to him realize that he's being consumed by his search, losing touch of what's most important in the process. No spoilers, but the ending of the questline is pretty bittersweet, and it's one that we can sympathize with, at least to a degree. We do almost anything to save the ones we love, and this questline does a good job of exploring how that love can tear a person apart. In the end, it feels like Sebastian's set of missions just got a lot more development time than the other 2, and I think that's a real shame. I found myself interested in meeting up with Sebastian again for the next quest, but I only completed the other 2 out of obligation. Next up, let's take a look at assignments. There's roughly 25 spells to learn in the game, but to unlock most of them, the player will have to complete tasks set by the professors in the open world. This can range from killing certain enemy types, collecting certain resources, brewing specific potions, flying through balloon markers, and using certain spells a handful of times. Upon completing these tasks, the player can return to the professor to learn a new spell. And that's about it for assignments. It is nice that the requirements can often be completed while working on the other mission types, and earning a new spell at the end is a really cool reward for your arsenal. Many of these spells are of course used in combat, but I will give credit here, as many of them also double dip, as you may have to use them while exploring or solving puzzles to progress. For example, there's puzzle rooms that can only be accessed with Depulso, there's dark caves that need to be lit up with Lumos, and there's even puzzle box platforms to move using the famous Wingardium Leviosa. They did a nice job of giving the spell's purpose outside of just fighting. Now, one of the most disappointing components of Hogwarts Legacy would be its side quests. They are oftentimes just generic fetch quests devoid of interesting characters, unique locations, awesome rewards, or even just a cool miniature story. As I sit here about to write this section, I'm actively having to go back and review the footage in an attempt to jumpstart my brain into remembering what some of them were about. It's that bad. One example would include this mission where a student tasks you with tracking down her missing uncle. You go to the camp where he was last seen, you find a note, you follow his footsteps to another camp where you kill more enemies and eventually free him. Like, it's fine, it's a setup we've seen for side quests many times before, and usually there's something else included to spice it up. But that just isn't the case here. You get the bare minimum formula with no additions. I mean, there's combat, and as we will come to see, it's not bad, but it's not enough to carry an experience like this in the same way it might in a game like Horizon Forbidden West. So without any supplementary components, it ends up feeling like something we've been doing for years now. And that can be said of many of the game's side missions. Whether it's navigating an enemy-filled dungeon leading to Honeydukes, or returning a stolen family crest, saving a magical beast, or just clearing out a camp of enemies, everything is pretty one-note and generic. It's checklist gameplay without anything to spice it up. That gameplay is fine for our next category of content, but for side missions, you'd expect a little bit better. And finally, there's the actual checklist gameplay that you'd expect to find populating any open world game map. This includes things like Merlin Trials, where you complete miniature puzzles to access more gear slots, or Karen Dungeons, where you'll clear out enemies for loot. Or there's Ancient Magic Remnants, where you'll gather more of it to increase your meter's capacity, and of course there's arenas where you can face waves and waves of enemies. Alongside of these pieces of content, there's also many collectibles. All in all, this collection is pretty standard stuff for those wanting to spend longer with the game after completing the main story. For the most part, I find most of this content to be fine, rather inoffensive, but I do take exception with the Merlin Trials. Loot is surprisingly a relative factor in this game, but at the beginning, your inventory space for items is extremely limited. 20 slots, that's it. This is concerning when there's 6 different pieces of equipment to have on your character at one time. Hats, gloves, glasses, robes, normal clothes, and neckwear. You will quickly fill up your allotment, forcing you to either destroy excess loot or travel somewhere to sell it. It's a hassle and is extremely annoying. To offset this, completing Merlin Trials will give you more slots, but often these puzzles simply aren't fun to solve. They are repetitive archetypes of puzzles that wear you down quickly. I solved enough to get up to like 24 or 26 inventory slots, and then I just went with it. Regardless of how you feel about this content, limiting players' inventory space so drastically in a game with even a decent amount of loot is a really mind-boggling move. Now, that was a bit of a tangent, but it's a noteworthy criticism that needs to be mentioned. So, overall, the quests in Hogwarts Legacy are alright. They're at their best when they're allowing our character to dive headfirst into some of the most iconic locations or ideas from the books and movies. Outside of that, it very much feels like a hodgepodge of side content that other, better open world games leave on the cutting room floor. Regardless of what you're doing in-game, you'll never be too far away from needing your trusty wand. Combat is most certainly to break out in nearly everything you do. So, how does it work? Well, it's inspired by the Batman Arkham series, but the emphasis here is on ranged combat instead of melee. You'll still have that back and forth flow between attacking and defending. The key requirement of the player in this style of combat has always been reaction time, as you'll be expected to pause your onslaught to either block, parry, or dodge incoming attacks. The defensive maneuver required of you varies on the type of attack that's levied at you. A dodge roll works in all instances, but it doesn't provide any sort of beneficial counterplay. Sometimes there's unblockable attacks, where you'll have no choice but to dodge roll, which keeps it within your rotation of moves. However, most of the time, you'll want to block and parry an attack which will briefly stun an opponent, opening up a further window to attack them. It's pretty standard stuff in 2023, but it feels fresh enough here because of the shift from melee to ranged, as well as the spell diversity. Now, there are enemies that can still attack you using axes, swords, or even their claws if they're a beast. These are sprinkled in with ranged enemies who will fight with either crossbows or their own spells. You, on the other hand, are limited to straight ranged combat. This means that keeping your distance from enemies is often the right choice, as getting up close offers no advantage to you while also empowering melee enemies against you. I think this change is fine, but it does lead to less second-to-second engagement, as standing 20 feet away from an opponent and blasting at them doesn't have the same rush as being dropped right into the middle of a 20-on-1 brawl. In terms of your arsenal, you of course have spells. There's a basic attack cast that does some decent damage, but utilizing your heavy hitting spells like Expelliarmus, Bombardo, and Incendio are what will carry you to victory. The 3 spells I just mentioned are categorized as damaging spells, and there's 5 of them in total for you to play with. However, there's also 5 other categories of spells, 3 of which are related to combat: movement, status effects, and the unforgivable curses. These categories are made evident to the player using color coding, which was smart. Through the perk system, you can unlock more spell wheel slots, meaning you can color code each one for efficiency. Anyway, the movement spells are purple and will often do just that. They will pull an enemy closer, they'll repulse them away, or send them flipping through the air. Simple. Status spells like Glacius will freeze an enemy, while Leviosa will levitate them. To be honest, these 2 categories of spells, movement and status effects, go to the wayside in combat quite often. They don't do direct damage, and so often they get out-prioritized in usage. Now, some enemies will create shields that must be broke using a spell of the corresponding color, and that's really the only time I've found myself switching to these other spell types. As previously mentioned, some do have usage outside of combat, which is great, but while fighting, they often feel disappointing and unnecessary. I'll just stick with Confringo. I mean, why even use these other moves when they don't do damage? Then of course, there's the 3 unforgivable curses. Crucio tortures enemies while doing chip damage, Imperio will allow you to mind control an enemy temporarily, and Avada Kedavra will outright kill an enemy. You can unlock these 3 attacks by completing Sebastian's questline, and you're even given a chance to turn down learning them, which is a cool moment of player expression. Me? Well, hell yeah, I'll take all the advantages in combat I can get, so sign me up for them. Although, I will say they did a great job of making you feel bad about learning them using story beats and character development, so good on them. If you've played the game, you know what I mean. But anyway, I decided to learn them because I wanted to see their functionality in combat. As you'd expect, these all proved to be powerful tools. Instantly KOing a huge troll or high-level enemy using the killing curse was an exceptionally strong move, even if it was a bit anticlimactic. There are instances where you can use it on bosses and it just trivializes the fight, but I think that's fine. It's about player expression and I'm all for it. With that being said, it does create a bit of dissonance between the story and the gameplay. Your character is supposed to be the chosen one, a savior predestined to save wizard kind using ancient magic. You are, in every sense of the word, an idyllic hero. But you're still a child, so when you go around using the killing curse on human enemies, it just doesn't feel right. Sure, these enemies are murderers and poachers and whatnot, but that doesn't mean your 16-year-old character should go around just killing them off. It creates a clash, at least it did for me anyway, it felt uncanny. But yeah, overall, that's how combat is structured. You can cast spells, dodge and parry enemy attacks, and try to win against the odds. Sure, there are a few other elements like potion buffs and attack minions, but that's the main crux of it. There's a lot of options, but not a ton of depth. Now, are there any issues with it? Yes. For me, there's 3. Primarily difficulty, and to a lesser extent enemy variety and unfair moments. Starting with difficulty, and I can't help but to recommend playing on hard mode over normal. On the normal difficulty, I think I died maybe 1 time. So long as you have even 10 health potions, you'll be in good enough shape to win any fight. In smaller encounters, you can easily read the telegraphed enemy attacks and respond in the gracious amount of time between tell and damage. And in larger encounters with more enemies, you may get caught off guard, as enemies can attack in quick succession, but you can always just heal the damage away if you came prepared. As a result, this game often feels like a power fantasy, especially owed to the level of animation and sound work that adds a ferocity to each cast of a spell. This is doubly true when you unleash your ancient magic, which will often just outright kill an enemy, again adding to that dissonance. There's sometimes a brutality about the combat that makes you feel badass, but is certainly a bit suspect within the context of the story. Anyway, my overall point here is that combat is often too easy. It can feel more like a chore than an engaging back and forth, especially as you get more powerful spells and better gear. I often debate if I should be playing games on hard mode to get a better feel of their mechanics, and this is one case where I probably should have. Next up, we have enemy variety. There's a few classes of enemies: humans, goblins, ancient knights, and beasts. These of course have different subclasses like spiders and wolves for beasts, or straight magic users and animaguses for humans. Still, it often felt like the game was missing 2 or 3 enemy types that would have alleviated some of the repetition. Many fights just end up being against the same types of goblins and humans that it's impossible to avoid the repetitive feeling, especially when the difficulty isn't challenging you a whole lot. And finally, there's a few instances of unfair enemy behavior. Often the game can only challenge you by throwing you into rooms with tons of enemies and asking you to parry and dodge attacks in very quick succession. You're trained to dodge or parry once and then respond with more attacks, but in these sorts of rooms, a flurry of quick attacks can feel cheap as a result. Also, there's an issue with enemy floatiness, and it's appeared in the Arkham games before. Essentially, enemies can slide on the ground to close distances on you to secure a hit. It's particularly noticeable when facing larger enemies like trolls or some of the big beast bosses. It just feels cheap, not to mention some of the goblins can teleport behind you. It almost feels like the developers couldn't find a way to really push the combat to that next level without simply cranking up the numbers. As a result, we get some of these moments that don't feel properly balanced in an effort to defeat you. Overall, I think combat is fine, above average at the very least. The emphasis on ranged instead of melee in this Arkham style does feel quite fresh, especially when experimenting with new spells. It can provide a true power fantasy for the player. With that being said, while it never dips into the realm of tedium, it's quite easy to feel like you're going through the motions, using the same spells once you've unlocked them without being challenged in new and fair ways consistently. Power fantasies are great for a while, but once you start feeling like nothing can push back against you, it ends up being a bit boring. When I talk about RPG elements within Hogwarts Legacy, I'm envisioning 2 very different things. On one hand, we have standard mechanical binary choices that affect your character's stats. This includes things like equipping different gear, or maximizing on spell efficiency, or even just choosing perks from the skill tree. On this front, I think Hogwarts Legacy is par for the course. The gear in particular is painfully average, as most of it is either unusable, owed to lower stats, or it just makes your character look extremely goofy. Thank goodness there's a transmog system. Anyway, many open world games of the last 5 years or so have adopted these sorts of elements. Hogwarts Legacy doesn't really do anything new with these ideas, nor does it really implement any of them in a particularly distracting way. The upgrades are marginal but important to keep up with so that you can survive and endure as enemies reach higher and higher levels. There really isn't anything else I want to talk about on this front. It's basic skill trees and basic gear progression. However, on the other hand, we have the very subjective meaning behind the idea of role-playing games. The ability for players to live out another fantasy while becoming completely immersed within it, assigning their own agendas, limitations, character backgrounds, and more to tailor the experience to what they want. And this is where I think the game shines most, in allowing its players to live out the fantasy of being a Hogwarts student. It's not something I personally did while playing, but I can see how many longtime fans could and would choose to play in a much more in-tuned way. I say this because of how the systems in place let you live out the fantasy. So here are some examples of that in action. It starts, of course, with making your own custom student using the character creator. It's by no means the most robust creator of all time, but it does a good enough job of letting you put yourself into the game. If you want a beard though, you're out of luck. Still, it's sufficient. So anyway, when you reach the castle for the first time, you'll go through the sorting ceremony as all newcomers to the school do. You can answer the questions honestly and go with their recommendation, or you can choose the house that you feel best suits you. Then of course, there's Hogwarts itself. I've already talked about how well realized it is, as you can easily spend time just wandering about, as you pretend to run from class to class, living out a daily life before returning to your dormitory. As part of the story progression, you'll take a bunch of classes, but the brilliant part is that many of these rooms can be returned to later with things to do. For example, you can brew potions in Professor Sharp's room, grow plants in the herbology greenhouses, or care for some beasts on the castle grounds. So, for example, if you wanted to roleplay a complete potions class, you can do that. You can pick the potion you want to make, go out and gather the ingredients, and then brew it in the classroom. There's nothing stopping you from stepping into that fantasy. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's the Room of Requirement, which is truly incredible. This is a fully customizable space where you can engage in many different activities. You can brew potions here, you can upgrade gear, you can identify hidden gear, you can grow plants, and much, much more, but the most notable thing you can do would be the beast sanctuaries. You have the ability to go out in the open world and capture beasts. Saving them from the poachers can be rewarding enough, but you're also able to brush, feed, and breed them here in the room in exchange for valuable resources. It's something you never have to partake in if you don't want to, but it's just sitting here waiting for you to interact with, and I think that's brilliant. And if you want to upgrade the room further by adding new equipment, you can always stroll down to Hogsmeade for new spellcrafts, while perhaps grabbing a few new potion ingredients along the way. Really, the only thing missing in this game to truly immerse yourself into the Hogwarts experience is Quidditch. And while that's ultra disappointing, at least there's still some time trials you can run on your broom. So between all of this, hopefully it does a sufficient enough job in selling you on the possibilities. I like Harry Potter, but it's not my obsession. If it is for you, Hogwarts Legacy delivers an unparalleled opportunity for you to live out the fantasy, and that is by far the game's greatest strength. Okay, back to reality now. Let's have a look at the narrative elements of Hogwarts Legacy. To be honest, I find this to be yet another component that is unremarkable when compared to other open world stories. I'll try my best to not get too spoilery here. The narrative revolves around your character, a newly arrived 5th year student at Hogwarts who has an affinity for ancient magic. Your ability to see and wield it has put you down a path you couldn't have seen coming. Your mentor, Professor Fig, is a public enemy against a goblin rebellion leader called Ranrock. Ranrock seeks to locate and harness the ancient magic for himself, and use it to overthrow wizard and witch kind, cementing goblins at the top of the pyramid after centuries of being second-class citizens. They could have played the goblins' plight in a more sympathetic light, which would have created some interesting moral dilemmas and gray areas to explore, but no. Ranrock is very quickly shown to be evil, both in his menacing design and the murderous spree he and his followers embark upon. It's another missed opportunity for depth. Anyway, along the way, your character befriends many fellow students at Hogwarts, along with some of the locals, as you seek answers about an ancient magic repository. Essentially, you and your allies are trying to reach it before Ranrock does. To find it though, you'll have to prove your worthiness to the 4 ancient keepers who protect that repository. Throughout the main story, you'll be asked to complete trials to show your merit and strength of character, and while doing so, you'll also be shown visions of a witch who came before you who allowed the power of the ancient magic to overwhelm her. This witch, named Isadora, used the ancient magic to remove pain from people's hearts, which sounds good on paper, but is ultimately just removing a part of their identity and their humanity. Not to mention, those removed emotions, well, they had to go somewhere. And that's all I'll say on that. But this character helps build towards the conclusion as the Keepers implore you to not go down the same path that she did. Right? That makes sense. They don't want you to end up like her. The game concludes predictably with a final clash against Ranrock where you must defeat him after he's accessed the ancient magic. The game spends a long time building towards a choice for your character, to either protect the ancient magic or use it selfishly like Isadora. And then in the end, you don't get to make that choice. It's really anticlimactic. It makes sense that a hero wouldn't use it, but why even make it a relevant theme then? So I'll limit the story recap there, as I don't want to spoil the game in its entirety. Instead, I want to say that I didn't find this one to be very interesting, owed both to the overall plot as well as the characters involved. Starting with the overarching narrative, and it's quite one note. Much like the game's smaller side quests, this story is about a universally good person stopping a threat that's practically irredeemable. Often stories like this can be made into something special if the characters stand out, but here they don't. As a result, this is a pretty one-note generic story that severely lacks any nuance, moral dilemmas, or anything that feels special. I imagine I'll forget the game's story within a month or two now that I've finished it up. This plotline, and really the dialogue as a whole, isn't helped by the lackluster written material. Often, conversations feel like 2 computers talking to one another. That's because it often feels like characters can't read between the lines and infer on their own. Meanwhile, the dialogue options available for you to choose makes it feel like you're examining a witness. An NPC will tell you their spiel, and then you can go through and press for more information one point at a time. It doesn't feel very natural, and while many games are guilty of this, it almost feels worse here because sometimes your character will just repeat back the same lines. For example, in this side quest, a character asks you to steal a dangerous plant from the hidden herbology corridor to help him prove that he's not a coward. Yes, it's ironic. After he explains that, you're given the option to ask about what you can expect to find down there. Your character asks what plants can he expect to find in the hidden herbology corridor, when to me, it feels like he could have just said, "What can I expect to find down there?" The hidden herbology corridor is obviously being referenced without dragging out the question. I hope you see what I mean. It may sound like a nitpick, but the game is chock full of instances like this, and it can really suck you out of the experience. It's a bit uncanny is all. The game is marred with weak writing, and ultimately results in a lackluster plot. When it comes to characters, there really isn't anything much better. Your character is of course fully customizable and is meant to be role-played, so they can't be anything too enticing on their own. They keep you pretty vanilla, and it makes me wonder if the game would have been better if you remained silent. The supporting cast is also underwhelming. All the professors are pretty forgettable, as you won't spend enough time with most of them to build any sort of connection. And yes, that even goes for the gorgeous Professor Garlick. Honestly, she's one of the best surprises in the game. I feel bad that I even spoiled it for you. You see all these old professors and then bam, hold your horses, who is that? That was a great moment, and the funny memes it's inspired have made me chuckle a few times. And then, of course, there's Professor Fig and the Four Keepers, who are also really boring. You know it's pretty bad when you're struggling to remember most of their names without the aid of a Google search. There's just no substance to many of them. You don't feel the roles they are meant to take in the story. Fig is supposed to be a mentor, but you spend so little time with him that you never really buy it. And the same can be said with almost every other character. How even the villains fall victim to this. Again, I'll come back to Sebastian as being the best character in the game because he's really the only one who goes through an arc of some sort. We understand his passion for wanting to help his sister, but it becomes increasingly difficult to justify his behavior and his actions. He loses touch with everything around him in pursuit of the goal. It's tragic and it's bittersweet, and that's good. The game needed more characters like that. Everyone else seems to end the game as the same person they were at the beginning, and to me, that doesn't make for good storytelling. At the end of the day, the story here in Hogwarts Legacy is incredibly generic, and leaves me wondering how they thought this was good enough to carry the experience. In a world as expansive as this one, I would have liked to see the developers take some liberties and come up with something a bit more entertaining and worthwhile, rather than this decent but generic story. Perhaps they weren't given the creative freedom to do much else, but I can't help but to feel a bit let down by this story. It's not terrible, but it's certainly one that feels familiar. Working towards the end of this review now, and we come to the presentation section. When it comes to graphics, I've already pretty much shared my thoughts earlier. The open world is often pretty devoid of rich detail or bright colors that might enhance it. Instead, it stays true to the often washed out, unappealing colors of dark green, gray, brown, and others like it. Now, there is one cool moment where the open world changes drastically, and I won't spoil for you what it is. You may have seen it in the footage, but I won't tell you, and that's cool. But that's really it. Most of the open world is pretty plain. A lot of the game's finest detail work can be found in Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, and is truly a spectacle to behold. It creates a juxtaposition that is kinda mind-bending. The difference between these two locations and the open world itself really does feel like night and day. There are a few scripted moments of beauty to be found in the open world, but outside of these, I'd expect more from a PlayStation 5 game by this point. I understand this game wasn't built specifically for this next-gen console, or I guess it's current-gen now, but it's by no means the best-looking game on the platform. But really, who cares? It looks good enough, right? So let's move on. Music. Hogwarts Legacy does a wonderful job of reinventing the music heard in the Harry Potter movies without ripping it off one for one. This game does a careful job of delivering magically inspired tunes with a heavy emphasis on brass and string instruments. The main castle theme in particular was noteworthy, but I also must give a shout out to the other sound work elements, such as the sound of spells whizzing by you, or the little jingle that plays after completing a quest. All of these fit right into the magical theme that a franchise like this utilizes so heavily. Certainly one of the better elements of the presentation. Sticking with audio, and the only component that let me down was the voice work, as once again, it just feels rather plain and generic. There really wasn't any iconic voices or performances to be heard here, and when the writing is average at best, it adds to the monotony. Another complaint I had early on was that my character sounded extremely squeaky after I slightly raised the pitch in his voice. Listening to that voice always sucked me out of the experience, but luckily you can change it, so credit to them for that. Lastly, I wanted to make a note about the level design, because it's another element to the game that stood out to me as being somewhat unexceptional. Throughout the open world, you can find dungeons to enter, ranging from cellars to caverns to castles. Unfortunately, I hardly felt compelled to enter them outside of quests that brought me directly to them. The unremarkable loot rewards were one factor in this, but another was simply owed to how repetitive they felt. None of them were exactly the same, but there were repeated environmental objects, as well as copied geographical layouts. And as a result, many of the dungeons felt formulaic and not worth taking the time to to explore. Hogwarts Legacy is a game that the childhood version of myself longed for, one where I could have become a student at Hogwarts, immersing myself into the school and its classes for hours at a time. For anyone still searching for that sort of experience in 2023, this game will deliver in spades. However, going beyond that, an individual exploration of this game's systems, mechanics, stories, and quests reveals something that truly struggles to feel special or new. The combat is somewhat fresh, but fails to evolve in interesting ways as the story progresses. The open world itself struggles to pull you in with its litany of activities, whether they be generic side quests or repetitive checklist map markers. And the story, while decent, fails to leave an impression on its players. Now, all of this might make it sound like Hogwarts Legacy is a disaster, but honestly, this to me is a case where the experience is more than the sum of its parts. When you pull all of this together, there's enough here to keep you playing and invested until the story concludes, and there's still plenty to do once the credits roll if you're so inclined. To me, Hogwarts Legacy captures the magic of nostalgia. It brought me back to the days of my childhood and allowed me to rediscover why I had so much love for this franchise in the first place. Nostalgia can often have a blinding effect though, and that's why my usage of the word magic in the title has a dual meaning. It can quickly lull us into a feeling of security, peace, and happiness by tapping into our best memories, but simultaneously, it can prevent a shield against criticism for some of our favorite things. While I don't care to dive into the discourse surrounding this game, I think it's important for speculative buyers to walk away from this video with one thing in mind. This game is not the 1 out of 10 piece of garbage that some claim it to be, but it's also not the 10 out of 10 crowning achievement that others would lead you to believe. It falls somewhere in the middle. It's a good but not great open world game that's enhanced through a player's personal connection to the Harry Potter license. Many of the game's shortcomings are masked by a player's affection for the franchise, and there's nothing wrong with that, so long as we stay honest with our assessment. For me, that's why I was able to enjoy this game much more than I would have if it were a generic wizard adventure. And to me, that is the magic of nostalgia. Thanks for watching. Alright guys, finally, I've finished up reviewing my first major game of 2023 here on the channel. This year has been off to an incredible start, as there's so many titles just whizzing by. Some will certainly go to the wayside in terms of coverage on this channel, but I'm hoping to cover as many of these games as I can in the months to follow. July and August seem to be somewhat barren at the time of writing this, so maybe we'll catch up on some games like Wolong Fallen Dynasty, Dead Space Remake, Forspoken, Resident Evil 4 Remake, and others around that time. As for upcoming videos, I definitely want to cover Atomic Heart, the Horizon Forbidden West DLC called Burning Shores, as well as Jedi Survivor, Redfall, and others. I appreciate you guys staying patient with me. That Pokemon Scarlet and Violet video really ballooned on me and ate up a ton of time in January and February. Hopefully I can ramp up production from here. Anyway, be sure to let me know your thoughts on Hogwarts Legacy below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me on Twitter at NopeNapNarp, join our Discord, the link is below, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.